Everyone else? Cool, awesome. Welcome everyone, bienvenue, bonjour tout le monde. Thank you everyone for coming to the 50th event of Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technology Speaker and Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum, and I'm a professor of Feminist and Social Justice Studies at McGill and the organizer of the series. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technology Speaker and Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. We are hosting 4 virtual events this winter. Next week, Dr. Max Liberon will be speaking. The following weeks are Mindy Sue and Dr. Alex Hanna. You can find our full schedule as well as video recordings of past events at disruptingdisruptions.com. So that's the redirect URL, disruptingdisruptions.com. The other URL is way too long to remember. You can also find our list of sponsors, including Shirk, Milieu, Mila, the DIGS Lab, and more. So now over to Dr. Stefanie Duguay.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. I'm Stefanie Duguay. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University, and I'm the director of the Digital Intimacy, Gender, and Sexuality Lab, the DIGS Lab. The DIGS Lab seeks to understand the shifting roles that digital media and technologies take in relation to identity, relationships, and individuals' everyday intimate lives. We are absolutely thrilled to co-host tonight's event. Dr. Brock's research is integral to understanding Black identity online, and his work introduces digital research methods for centering cultural identity in explorations of digital practices and contexts.
So everyone, for this event, recording is enabled so the event can possibly be embedded on our website. But don't worry, only the speakers will be shown in the video. We also have a Q&A option available. So throughout the event, you may type your questions in the Q&A box below, and there will be some time at the end for Dr. André Brock to answer them. We can't guarantee that every question will be answered, but we are grateful for the discussion that you generate. Thank you to our captioner for today, Sarah. Past series speakers Suzanne Kite and Jess McLean have pointed to the physical and material impacts of the digital world. While the events this semester are virtual, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we are on. We must always be mindful of the lands that the servers enabling our virtual events are on. Furthermore, as the series seeks to draw attention to power relations that have been invisibilized, it is important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and current political practices. The series is affiliated with the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University. Both McGill and Concordia University are located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Furthermore, the ongoing organizing efforts by Indigenous communities such as the Wet'suwet'en people at the Innistone Camp, water protectors, and the people involved in land back movements make clear the ever-present and ongoing violence in colonial violence in Canada. Interwoven with this history of colonization is one of enslavement and racism. This university's namesake, James McGill, enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. It was in part from the money he acquired through these violent acts that McGill University was founded. These histories are here with us in this space and inform the conversations we have today. I encourage you to learn about the lands that you're on. Nativeland.ca is a fantastic resource for doing so.
Okay, we are delighted to welcome as our speaker today, Dr. André Brock, who is an associate professor in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He is an interdisciplinary scholar with an MA in English and Rhetoric from Carnegie Mellon University and a PhD in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His scholarship includes published articles on racial representations in video games, Black women in weblogs, whiteness, Blackness, and digital technoculture, as well as groundbreaking research on Black Twitter. His article, From the Black Hand Side, Twitter as a Cultural Conversation, challenged social science and communication research to confront the ways in which the field preserved a colorblind perspective on online endeavors by normalizing whiteness and othering everyone else, and sparked a conversation that continues as Twitter in particular continues to evolve. So Dr. Brock, I'm just going to update your bio a little bit and mention that Dr. Brock's book, Distributed Blackness, African-American Cybercultures, was the winner of the 2021 Harry Shaw and Katrina Hazard Donald Award for Outstanding Work in African-American Popular Culture Studies, given by the Popular Culture Association. and also the winner of the 2021 Nancy Bain Book Award from the Association of Internet Researchers. So folks, if you haven't picked up the book yet, you'll definitely want to, and bonus, you can find it open access from NYU Press. So without further ado, please join us in welcoming Dr. Brock.
Greetings and salutations. Let's share the screen so that you don't have to just look at my face. You can also see this glorious book cover. All right. I'm hoping that you guys get to see it and we can go ahead and start talking about it. So thank you, Alex and Steph, for inviting me here today. I'm very happy to be the first speaker of the calendar year and of this series, maybe of this series for this season. I will give a little bit of a guide to how Andre presents. I talk fast and I have fairly dense presentations. So please feel free to take notes if you don't mind. And then we can go back and discuss concepts which I may have skimmed past or garbled in my stuttering while I was giving this presentation. But enough about me. Today's talk pulls from some concepts I began to consider when writing Distributed Blackness. My goal in that book was to unpack what Black technology use or Black technoculture would look like from the perspective of Black folk. In doing so, however, I had to consider the context in which Black technoculture is gestated or gestated, take your pick, which is the white Western world, right? And so one outcome of this work was an effort to theorize algorithmic racism as manifested on social media as a way of understanding the harms that these algorithms inflict upon Black digital practitioners. And I call this algorithmic racism, weak tie racism, for reasons you'll see later on. Like other notable scholars, I argue that the computer is an agent and a practitioner of racialized activity, but today's presentation will hopefully illuminate how I got to this point. Recent conversations around the spread of misinformation often revolve around the role of algorithmic, surveillance, and social media and imposing a techno-dystopian information society upon us, whether that is disseminating, radicalizing conspiracies to naive internet users or misinformation, or to exacerbating existing structural discriminations on minority population groups, right? Or in my case, investigating the beliefs about information technology design and use held by minoritized groups. What remains clear across all of these, however, is that online harms are not a problem that can be solved by a technical fix. Instead, we must consider them as part of a larger sociocultural problematic where racism is an infrastructural tension pervading all institutions, all technologies, and our socialities. So what can we gain from understanding racism as infrastructure? To begin to interrogate that, I take on this concept that I've been calling Western technoculture. And it's not mine. I stole it from Leo Marx and Dienerstein and a number of other people, Phil Agre, Langdon Winter, and the like. And for Western technoculture, it is, as Dienerstein describes it, the mythos that America is a technological society, right? And for Western technoculture, I argue that there are tensions, libidinal tensions or beliefs that revolve around, broadly speaking, technophilia or technophobia. We teach our students to guard against these perspectives, technophilic or technophobic, on technology design and use by noting that these extremes obscure the necessary nuance and critical perspectives needed to properly understand how culture and technology work with one another. There are a multitude of examples of technophilia to work with, whether it is the, I can't think of the right euphemism, the genital waving exercise of the 3 billionaires to see who can get to the outer reaches of lower Earth orbit, or the current fascination with Web3 and NFTs, or even just the unchecked Silicon Valley and Wall Street hosannas of innovation and disruption, all the way to the reemergence of transcendental beliefs of recreating our bodies in a metaverse where suddenly we'll all just get along. Those of you who remember Second Life and other previous aspects of virtuality know that we will not just all get along, but nevertheless, technophilic belief insists that we should at least adhere to those beliefs as we and begin to take on these practices in everyday life. Simultaneously, technophobic beliefs circulate through and circle the periphery of mainstream attention. In many cases, we found, in the case of Facebook, that there are algorithmically driven exhortations where vaccine refusers, folk frightened about cell phone radiation and 5G spectrum, and even climate change deniers aggregate on social media spaces and elsewhere in order to describe their fears about how technology will change them into beings that they both find unrecognizable and unwelcome. Less visibly, but just as prominently, technocultural beliefs, both technophobic and technophilic, promote the appearance of democratic beliefs. And I say the appearance of democracy because I don't necessarily believe that the web is a democratic space. It is more, as Graham Turner describes it, a demotic space with the appearance of democracy, right? About who can speak, who can be heard, but most importantly, who deserves the designation of human in our favorite online and digital communication tools, or in the algorithmic tools that are increasingly being deployed to control our everyday work and leisure lives. So I started off hard. I came with the theory first. Let me give you an example. So as Steph and Alex have mentioned or shown, I have a book that talks about Blackness and technology, or Black technoculture. And it's an interesting pursuit because America was built upon the bodies of Black men, women, and children as objects, objects of fear, objects of pathology, and objects of violence. Black folk are constantly the subject, or I should say, the object of technical and technocultural fixes to cultural problems where they are the perceived cultural problem. Indeed, for many institutions, such as higher education or policing, technology is positioned as the most efficient solution to discipline long-standing social ills exemplified by Black deviants. We could even talk about the ways that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the least efficacious of the vaccines, was largely deployed to minority communities, and we've since found that it does little or next to nothing against the most recent variant. And can be understood as a technical fix to a social problem, right? For me, I argue in Distributed Blackness that Black folk are natural and expert users of technology, no matter what the anti-Blackness and modernity of Western technoculture prefers to position them, right? And in the process, I cast them as Black technical experts, subjects, and agents. There are examples of this in modern media. I could use Black Panther, the movie, God rest Chadwick Boseman, as compelling evidence for that, but I instead turned to the first Black authored network browser, Victor Green's Negro Motorist Greenbook, which inspired the recent outstanding HBO series Lovecraft Country. Also, rest in peace to Michael K. Williams. As a traveler over America's developing automobile infrastructure of highways, gas stations, rest stops, and leisure activities, Green was deeply concerned with navigating the context of white supremacist law, practice, and belief through which these roads wound. However, survival was not his only imperative. His vision was to expand the possibilities for Black vivification, or Black life, by providing Black travelers with a guide to locations where they could rest, refuel, or even relax. So the Green Book is more than a phone book or a catalog or a demonstration of resistance. It provides cultural metadata about a network, signaling nodes of Black life that Black motorists could avail themselves of during their journeys. But Lovecraft Country adds, superlatively, I think, to Victor Green's vision of a distributed Blackness is the monstrous apparition of the intersection of whiteness and technology. There was a prompt recently on my timeline asking what's the worst drive along American highways of 3 hours or more. And somebody mentioned Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania. And it was described as nothing but hills and racism. And I find that there are many highways and byways in the United States and Canada where the feigned civilities of comity and we can all get along are diminished. You'll begin to see more conservative fundamentalist beliefs about God and country as seen by Trump signs and Confederacy flags, even if you're not in the South. right? And so whiteness and technology comes together, and the fact that we're using these sophisticated vehicles on these sophisticated design roads, right? But nevertheless having to navigate cultural instances of sociality and dissociality, right? So where networks are erected ostensibly for freedom, democracy, and commerce, whiteness also sees them as pathways for domination, coercion, and even violence. And this is as true for technical networks as it is for the US highway system. So the question I've been working towards across my entire research stream is, are pathology, deviance, and resistance the only motives for Black online sociality? And from there, the answer is no. How to understand Black digital practice as productive, life-giving online behavior? My pursuit of the concept of Black technoculture depends upon encumbering American society and Western technoculture with their own practices of white supremacy, where the GOP prefers that books and promoting what they call critical race theory should be banned because they don't feel that white children need to learn about how their ancestors tortured and destroyed entire Black communities. I argue that we must indeed become familiar with those practices in order to understand the complexity that is North America, right? Because we could talk about how Canadian schools have these residential schools where there have been found vast graveyards of the bodies of children who were sent to those schools and torn away from their parents, right? So we should situate America's technical innovation and progress within the often brutal social, cultural, and ideological context in which they began and thrived. So distributed Blackness theorizes a Black cultural relationship with technology, drawing upon the Black experience in the West, an experience shaped by relationships with whiteness, with our own communities, with technology from a social and political subject position. And I stole this matrix, I'm sorry. I revised this matrix from one offered by Joel Dienerstein in a 2006 article, The Western Technocultural Matrix. And I still have 6 qualities as he does. And here are the 6 that I have: Blackness, modernity, America, intersectionality, indigenous style, and the future. Blackness for this matrix stands for the metaphysical and critical valences of Black cultural identity, revolving around subjectivity and cultural production. This phrasing does not ignore the political and ideological aspects of Black identity, but instead highlights the beliefs, the libidinal elements driving those aspects of Blackness and its relationship with technology, or the communitarian enactment of intentionality across social aspects of Black culture, or that Blackness is irreducibly social. You can also see that America has an asterisk. This is meant to signal that the United States is but one context for diasporic Blackness. A Trinidadian living in Toronto, a Nigerian living in Britain, all have shared markers of Blackness, but many different experiences. For my book, I remain within the context of Blackness as an ineffably American characteristic. America as an ideal, as an institution, and as a set of racialized practices is how I strive to contextualize what Black experiences are in this country. It's well suited as a technological ideal for Black technoculture because America, the nation, created Blackness in order to survive and thrive. Toni Morrison calls this American Africanism in her book, Playing in the Dark, where American ideals inform Black community beliefs in equality, democracy, and fairness, even as Black folk live every day, based on the understanding that the American telos of progress depends upon anti-Blackness. So the rest of today's presentation will revolve around modernity, that third one that's highlighted, right, from the period of colonial slavery in the Americas through today. For Black technoculture, modernity is precisely the informational, capitalistic, and institutional regime of anti-Blackness. Surveillance and sousveillance, digital redlining as outlined by Sophia Noble and also by Chris Gilliard, access to education, and even voting rights are all positioned in ways that limit, if not directly injure, Black folk on the way to reifying whiteness. For example, where modernity and capitalism insist that work is emancipatory and agentive, Omicron, Delta, and Black folk have long shown us that work only signifies servitude, misery, and subordination. Right? Analyses of Black modernity then require attention to those technical and technological substrates, right? The formal attributes of expressive culture and a distinctive moral basis where Blackness can be understood as human. One second. There we go. So the thing that the Black technocultural matrix alludes to, but never specifically spells out, is the quality of anti-Blackness. And the technocultural capacity and libidinal tension of anti-Blackness constructs Black bodies and Black identity as social death through slavery, through Jim Crow, through eugenics, phrenology, and social science, to criminal law and residential segregation. And these arrangements reify Western technoculture as how to do things to Black bodies and Blackness. I have a quote from the Field Sisters from their book Racecraft, where racism does not require races. And they go on to say that race as identity breaks down on the irreducible fact that any sense of self intrinsic to persons of African descent is subject to peremptory nullification by forcible extrinsic identification. And that forcible extrinsic identification here can be understood as algorithmic allocations of resource, whether attention, voting preferences, food stamps, or creditworthiness. The Field Sisters go on to say that race relations, right, as an analysis of society, takes for granted that race is a valid empirical datum and thereby shifts actions from the attentions that constitute racism to the traits that constitute race. So racist profiling gets euphemized into racial profiling, right? For scholars, for racists during Reconstruction and during Jim Crow, those traits might have included the formerly enslaved Africans' ignorance, laziness, brutality, criminality, subjection to uncontrolled passions, or incapacity for the moral and intellectual duties of civilization. For our post-World War II society, for our information society, as Frank Webster would describe it, our scholars who accept race, once ritually purified by this incantation socially constructed as a valid, the incantation socially constructed as a valid category of analysis, these traits become euphemized into difference, otherness, culture, or identity. Racecraft is first and foremost an ongoing set of social practices that continuously misconstrue racism for race. The former is a function of power and inequality, whereas the latter is purportedly grounded in biology and culture. By focusing on the inherent qualities of groups, whether residing in genes, values, or data, the analyst loses sight of the larger context in which those differences are conjured in the first place. Conjured because in the same way that witches need not exist for people to feel the effects of witchcraft, so too with race. Genetic and informational differences between racial groups need not actually exist for such claims to exercise political and social effects. And to expand it, to offer an example, Ruha Benjamin offers the example of Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson, Missouri, where the media described the event as an unarmed teenager was shot because he was Black. Or the more recent event in California, where an unarmed young Latino woman was shot while she was looking for dresses for her quinceanera, right, by a policeman looking for someone who in the end wasn't even armed, right? Racecraft converts power into difference insofar as Michael Brown's race, his being Black, is given agency and ontology, therefore veiling the work of multiple forms of racism that led a law enforcement official to shoot this young man to death. Michael Brown's Blackness did not pull the trigger, as the original formulation of the media mistakenly asserts. Rather, deeply entrenched forms of ideological paranoia and institutional pathology, which routinely conflate Blackness with criminality, ensured that Officer Darren Wilson would treat Michael Brown as a threat. In the social context characterized by racecraft, causal relationships are typically stated incorrectly. He was not shot because he was Black. He is Black because he was shot. That is, race is the result of the power of some people over others, right? And too often, in the way scholars formulate questions and the way public discourse makes sense of social disparities, subjugation is posited as an inevitable outcome of inherent racial difference, even when the historical record does not support it. And an article that will be appearing, actually the digital version came out at the end of 2021, two whole weeks ago, right? I have a conversation with one of my frequent collaborators, Khadija Abdurrahman, and I'm pretty open about talking about this recent furor over misinformation and disinformation and how much money has been spent over the last 5 or 6 years to demonstrate that it has become a problem for American democracy. But I go on to say that misinformation and disinformation are how the Americas have treated minority populations from their inception, right? Whether it's pitting white laborers against black laborers and then ending up with the draft riot mobs in New York in 1863, or the erasure of Tulsa's Greenwood District in 1921, right? Misinformation and disinformation are ways that America has used to control object populations and justify their disposal and treatment of them. And so it's funny to me now, funny in the sense of, haha, isn't that strange, right? That now that the American telos is being threatened, all of a sudden misinformation has become a problem. I started talking about information. Let me get to how I got to this point, right? And so the question as a scholar of technology, particularly if I'm talking about belief and anti-blackness, is how to understand belief as a technical capacity of information and data. So I begin from here. Arnold Pacey's conception of the tripartite nature of technology. Pacey argues that all technologies have 3 aspects: technical, organizational, and cultural. Right? And I changed these in my work to artifact, practice, and belief because I'm much more interested in interfaces and community discourses than I am about, say, perhaps the larger practices of content moderation, such as the scholar Sarah Roberts looks at. Right? Pacey contends that technologies are most often described and understood based on the first 2 qualities, which leaves cultural belief to implicitly yet powerfully shape our expectations of how those technologies alter the world and ourselves. But beliefs are intangible, right? Even as they help us make sense of who we are when we use technology. To operationalize and concretize belief, I turn to Lyotard's libidinal economy to unpack the tensions, the precognition and visceral reactions powering our understandings of the world as a rational place that shape our relationship to the avatar of rationality, the computer and online networks. Sarah Ahmed argues for effective economies, because I often get asked, and I'm sure you guys will too, why not affect, why libidinal economy? She says in effective economies, emotions play a crucial role in the surfacing of individual and collective bodies through the way in which emotions circulate between bodies and signs. I found Lyotard's argument to be more powerful for the work that I wanted to do, where he says that reason and desire are in constant tension, that political economy, that thing beloved by economists and politicians, right? That emphasis on rationality and exchange failed to capture the excesses of life or jouissance that infuse, surround, power, and or sabotage these exchanges. And in the American context, you can see this extremely clearly, where employers are complaining that people don't want to work during these days. And so they're having trouble doing staffing, leading to shortages on grocery store shelves or shortened hours in your favorite coffee shop. Instead of understanding that the virus has contributed to that, and we are struggling with not only our own mental health, but physical health, that of our children, that of our elders, they instead prefer to place it in terms that it's simply a labor problem, that it's something that can be fixed technically by saying, you know, we're proud to work, you need to work in order to live. But many of us have figured out that work is not the sum total of life. And so for me, Lyotard's libidinal economy helps me to understand the libidinal tensions that we can ascribe to technology. Here's the Western technocultural matrix, which means my slides are out of order. And so Dinerstein argues that Western technoculture is driven by these 6 beliefs: progress, religion, modernity, whiteness, masculinity, and the future. And by necessity, Dinerstein links the West to whiteness, in the process implying that technology works to the benefit of white supremacy. And what I do in distributed blackness and for this talk is to drill down a little bit into praxis, how anti-blackness can be quantified and commodified for capitalist profit and cultural and social capital. One set of implicit beliefs about the web, about the internet, about communication technologies as far back as the telegraph and the radio and the telephone, right, revolves around the libidinal tensions of comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, and sociality. We believe that the internet is capable of transmitting good sociality if only we can regulate individual behaviors. Even as we argue that the overwhelming concentration of meaning and distribution in social networks as a whole can lead to the spread of bad thought. Those of you who are Twitter users know that Twitter is often described as the worst place on earth, a designation which used to be reserved for YouTube, right? And that to me shows evidence that these beliefs shape our understanding of how these networks can be used. For good sociality, Vincent Mosco argues that we desire to retain our individuality and yet participate fully in a collective community. While for bad thought, mass media technologies have always been susceptible to claims of diminishing or destroying natural life, where natural typically refers to the interests of elites. But these technological myths of comity and ideology can be understood differently when it comes to race. But arguing for whiteness is only racism does a disservice to the infrastructural and institutional practices and beliefs that characterize whiteness as control. In Whiteness is Property, the canonical article by Cheryl Harris, she argues and provides nuance to white technical identity by arguing that whiteness is both an aspect of identity and a property interest. Remember I mentioned democracy earlier, right? And saying that it's not necessarily something which is understood as being available to everyone in a network. Some people just aren't entitled to it. This would be a property interest of whiteness. And this interest is deployable at the social, political, and institutional level to maintain control, to exclude others, and for the right to use and enjoyment. This last is most important for this presentation, as anti-blackness animates mediums and platforms where only one set of voices is valued, where only one viewpoint is honored, or in the case of Facebook, only one set of conservative viewpoints are honored, and where an epistemology of ignorance affords whiteness the privilege of never understanding how racism affects others. For the West in general, but for the United States in particular, anti-blackness and its institutional manifestation as racism is as integral to technocultural identity as are the ideals of progress, democracy, and modernity. As Lisa Nakamura writes, racism on the internet is not a glitch, but a feature. It is foundational. And those of you who've played multiplayer games on the Xbox and PC know this, right? If it is foundational, if not infrastructural, to the mode, manner, and meaning of digital practice and content that we see and participate in online. But while our gazes are drawn to the extremes of racism, the banality of racist belief manifests in everyday context, right? From what you see to who gets to speak. And a digression, a brief one, because I'm making this connection between anti-blackness and modernity implicitly, so let me be explicit, right? So discussions of technology tend to avoid white privilege as an investment in inequalities of knowledge or access, right? And they do that in order to avoid assessing its application across generic contexts that happen to be structured by whiteness. I chose and distributed blackness to explicitly acknowledge that the political economy of racism, mediated by the digital in form of investment strategies by venture capitalists, hiring practices, content production, algorithmic design, is driven by libidinal tensions between anti-blackness, capitalism, modernity, and necropolitics. So for the arts and society writ large, anti-blackness is a non-communicable structural position in society where the people who occupy the position of anti-blackness are incapable of being alienated because alienation is a quality of the human. For modernity and technoculture, anti-blackness can become understood as data and processes ostensibly proving that communities living outside normalcy are verifiably outside normalcy for profit or for governmentality. And for that last one, think about whether or not you've ever received notice saying your account has been suspended or banned. I know for the women of color and the queer folk that I follow, in many cases, they get banned from a particular social network service because they are responding to a racist affront. Not even a microaggression, sometimes it's just straight up aggressions, but in responding in kind and anger and using profanity, their accounts get banned and their aggressor, the person who's treating them badly continues to have their safety, right? So they are outside governmentality, right? They are coerced, they are imprisoned, they are apprehended by algorithmic and content moderation strategies to where they cannot participate until they are deemed having demonstrated contrition, or they might never get their account back. That's happened as well. In terms of the not too recent past, it's a little easier to see aspects of whiteness as an avatar of power in action. John Locke, the famous philosopher and writer on civic freedom and human liberty, owned slaves and invested in Caribbean plantations. And there is no conflict between those two modes of being. Think about Mark Zuckerberg owning 114 acres of indigenous Hawaiian land because he wants a place to use the beach privately, even though those lands are sacred to the indigenous folk in Hawaii. Same difference, right? There's no conflict between these two modes of being. Enlightenment discourse promoted that slavery was progressive and a development for both parties that was essential to the power relation, where the people who were being enslaved were uplifted by their contact with whiteness and slavery, right? It justified the civilization, quote unquote, of African and indigenous slaves while celebrating entrepreneurship based upon the natural exploitation of labor. So modernity in the West should be understood as information control and use, and as such has always been anti-Black. A really good example is Amazon's use of algorithms and computation to control its warehouse workers. I don't know if you know this, but Amazon has an algorithmic manager that assesses the pick rate of its workers, how quickly they can fulfill orders and have them ready to be sent out for shipping. Through the use of an algorithm, they can be assessed and fired by this algorithm without the intervention of a human manager. But that's technology, right? That's not. So instead of using Amazon, I prefer to reach back to the slave plantation where we could more clearly see the relationship between labor, picking, and Black bodies. And so for Caitlin Rosenthal in Accounting for Slavery, she writes, the ideal plantation was a model of efficiency because its premise was Black inferiority. Right? While plantations have been typically considered pre-modern, their complex labor structures, accounting practices, the invention of scientific managerial techniques, and infusions of venture capital to the gain of the investors and planters, rather than the state, mark them as clearly modern. Slaves were valued along livestock as economic commodities, helping to obscure their humanity and reinforce the commonly expressed views of planters and society that slavery was about business, not exploitation. The investment by absentee landlords or venture capitalists would have been impossible without a regular flow of accounting data from their Caribbean and American managers. So slavery capitalism quantified enslaved people, cataloging, classifying, and measuring according to traits of age, gender, beauty, skin color, strength, and attitude. And these data practices, which may sound very familiar to you, if you're familiar with ProPublica's work on Compass or Virginia Eubank's work on social welfare, on social work, these data practices reduce people to commodities and data, and they were traded as such, irrespective of family ties, personal desires, and aspirations, or indeed their very status for human beings. So anti-Blackness then underpinned the creation of the modern appetite for data, for managerial identity, right? And for the commodification of Blackness. I don't know if you remember during the recent set of tornadoes that devastated Tennessee, there was a driver that was out for Amazon who could see the tornadoes from her vehicle, and she contacted her manager and said, hey, I need to get to shelter, but I haven't finished delivering all my things. And her manager wrote back to her over text message, you don't need to worry about that. What you need to do is deliver your things. And we could say that that's simply how terrible capitalism is, but I would argue that capitalism works hand in hand with modernity to reduce the human body to only its labor potential. Its care and well-being is not of consequence or incidence. And for me, I tie that directly back to anti-Blackness. So as an example of the creation of the modern appetite for data and the commodification of Blackness, I look at what I've been calling mundane online racism. And this mundane online racism, I looked at through Black folks' discourses about seeing terrible videos of unarmed Black men and women being murdered by police. And I call this mundane online racism because it wasn't explicitly shared by a white person to traumatize or coerce a Black person. Instead, because Black folk tend to see and share content about race more than any other demographic, these videos quickly dominate their algorithmically constructed timelines and feeds. They achieve immense visibility through a conflagration or a dumpster fire of algorithmic publication, which draws energy from patterns of online practices, voracious social media feeds seeking the engagement desired by venture capitalists in order to justify their investment, and libertarian beliefs that all individuals should be able to express opinions without fear of censorship enacted through code, policy, and moderation. In effect, they were experiencing racism without races. Shout out to Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And some folk have quickly come up with a technical, non-technological fix, which is exhortations to not share those videos. But I wanted to think past an instrumental solution and try to dig through what the problematic itself was. So I talk about the libidinal algorithm or weak tie racism. And I came to this particular claim because in experiencing racism, Black folk must evaluate both the ontology and the epistemology, the what and the why of white supremacy, as well as how it affects them. Those of you in the know who have experienced microaggressions understand similarly that microaggressions require daily vigilance to assure, first of all, that that event happened and that one's sanity has not been compromised. Am I crazy, or did that white woman just call me an N-word under her breath? In online spaces, I argue that similar microaggressions happen thanks to the confluence of networked libidinal tensions that arise from the diffusion of racist and racialized content through social media practice, connectivity, and algorithmic publishing. And I call this phenomenon weak tie racism, right? Where racism manifests through digital and online media's affordances for sharing information, including but not limited to the algorithm, but also your affiliated networks of followers, followees, or whatever your particular network does. These microaggressions have no author. While the video has an origination point, it will sometimes list who uploaded it. The sharing of it is not, cannot be attributed to a particular author, and they are not individually performative, right? I'm not seeing the killing of Michael Brown and somebody then turning as if it was a TikTok duet and saying, yeah, you're next, Andre, right? They're not individually performative. Instead, the algorithm serves them up as a composite of developer and network beliefs about online sociality, leading to microaggressions at scale, or an anti-Black libidinal effect and affect on Black digital practice. And so I mentioned earlier, I probably should have brought this slide earlier too, that comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, is a presumed quality of discourse. So I came to weak ties because Granovetter's deeply influential essay argues that people who share weak relationship ties with others will kindly offer better access to information that may prove valuable to life circumstances. That is, people talk with one another who they are not related to through kinship ties, or even necessarily through work or religious affiliations, to share information in an environment that is presumed to be neutral, if not cordial. Those of you who are familiar with Ray Oldenburg's Great Good Place and its concept of third places, that's also a space of comedy, right? Presumably, one shares information with folk who have established a shared set of beliefs. But in distributed Blackness, I ask, and in an ideological environment predicated on racial subordination, consider instead that the comity enacted by information technologies draws upon the shared joy or libidinal tension of anti-Blackness for mainstream society. Through the aggregation of and interaction with hateful content, white and computational articulations of racism present intimate, intense libidinal tensions bonding the outgroup and the in-group. Weak tie racism is the means rather than the end. right? Perhaps the best way to describe it is as a hate speech act, as opposed to hate speech itself. And it comes to this point because likes and reposts alone are not necessarily microaggressive. I've shared, before I started paying attention to what I was actually doing, I've shared videos of people being violated by the police, right? And I didn't do it as microaggression, but more as an act of witnessing. Have you seen this shit, right? Look how terrible they treat us, right? Because it denotes affiliation or recognition in a social space that counters one's own beliefs or affiliations. For those of you who don't necessarily look at racial content, I would argue, let's talk about how badly the Chronicles of Boba Fett are being received to The Mandalorian, where people are hate watching Boba Fett because it's just not as good as The Mandalorian, but they're still watching it just so they can criticize it. Sorry, that's my own personal opinion. When the aggravation of likes causes one's feed to be populated by racist content, however, I feel that this demonstrates that weak-time racism occurs through the algorithmic facilitation and reproduction of banal social signals deemed important to the service through minute traces of social interactions promoted by algorithmic means. So that the mechanical enactment of white technical ideology is not hate speech, rather it's the promotion of content which is hateful. So the nuance different, but I think it's something important to think through. So a large part of digital practice is still textual, even during the rise of TikTok, right, and Instagram Live, and discursive, even as digital visual technologies have become a larger part of our everyday community practice. Code occupies some of this textual space, shaping the interfaces, mechanics, algorithms, and protocols through which digital practice happens. For weak-time racism, the social media algorithm's libidinal intensity is revealed. It is the catalyst and weak-time relationship between content and node, demanding as it does its own interaction and reciprocity to sustain the relationship between user and network. And one of the best examples I can give is I argue with my students every semester because I'm a troll. Is it a selfie if nobody sees it? Right? I argue, perhaps to the wrong, feel free to correct me. I also say hard G GIF, right? That a selfie is the act of posting a photo to a network for review and viewing by a network of people who you feel should be allowed to see it, whether that's in the membership on Instagram or whether it goes out publicly past those networks, right? Without the network, a selfie is just a picture. And when they argue with me, I tell them, well, do you post every picture you take to your network? Is every picture a selfie? They're like, no, I take 15, 16, 3 different pictures before I decide upon the one. I said, that one is the selfie. The rest are just pictures, right? And so this is what I mean when I say the interaction and reciprocity are necessary to sustain the relationship between user and network. Your act of publication to a network of affiliates is what powers the social media algorithm. And I would argue in the case of networks where shadow banning has been accused of being taken place, where images of Black folk are deprecated, such as the Twitter cropping algorithm, where if you had a picture of a white person and a Black person, the Twitter cropping algorithm would only focus the white person, no matter how you position the Black person in the photo, right? I argue that that itself is a manifestation of weak-time racism, right? There's no person who said to do that, but the algorithm was trained to recognize that the white person in that image is the one that is deemed worthy of viewership, right? So this weak-time racism manifests through digital and online media's affordances for injudiciously sharing information, right? And it includes but is not limited to social media content shared in a manner unschooled in pre-existing patterns of hypervisibility or a lesion of Black agency. Right? We know that microaggressions can be environmental, a characterization that explains to some extent the virtual spaces in which weak-time racism is encountered. Weak-time racism harms through accretion, right? The text is only experienced in the activity of production, and Barth describes this as slow violence, a violence that occurs gradually, even at the periphery of your vision, right? A violence of delayed destruction dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all, right? So the video of Michael Brown's body laying on the ground for 4 hours, the video of George Floyd being kneeled on for 9 minutes, some odd seconds, right, was not shared in the intent of the sharing of the video itself is not violence, but the content of it is. And the repeated viewing of that content contributes to the degradation of your interiority, of your spirituality. And this is not just for Black folk, this is for minority folk, this is for white folk as well, right? That video was painful to watch, right? And I argue that the thirst for engagement that these algorithms are driven by forces those images upon us. So I see weak-tied racism as a computational manifestation of microaggressions. When one sees a racist tweet, like those of our former president, receive hundreds of thousands of interactions, do we then blame the platform? Well, we kind of do. Right? Does the platform's features and affordances of sociality or techno-social comity, such as likes and shares to friends, does it make my cousin's retweet of Donald Trump's nastiness to my family a racist interaction? Right? The act of liking a video can be influenced by the already present signifiers of virality, right? But is correctly not assumed in and of itself a racist act. Yet its contribution to the viral spread of that content can be understood in the aggregate as weak-tie racism. Let's wind this down, shall we? So then how would it reshape our understanding of the internet if we acknowledge that racism and misogyny, but that's a different presentation, shapes the design of mundane technologies such as social media feeds? Racism for the West provides emotional intensity, pleasure, and intimacy, right? It has been noted elsewhere that Americans have historically shared media such as postcards from lynchings, right? Designed financial practices such as mortgage codicils, which say you cannot sell this property to a Black person, or otherwise operated from a belief about the subhumanity of Black folk. Why would the internet be any different? The internet, as an infrastructural implementation of weak-tie communication, is capable of racism without racism, right? Given its capacity to share information framed by the epistemological ignorance of the men, mostly men, who designed its tools and protocols. How do you fix this though? I don't know if it can be fixed. And I'm wary of technical solutions to online harms, or even the idea that ethics will fix the problems of technoculture. Because I mean, doctors have a code of ethics to do no harm, right? Yet Black women in the US routinely experience the highest rates of mortality in childbirth, right? In fact, Black women in multiple states, including here in Georgia, Mississippi, and North Carolina, are routinely ordered to undergo hysterectomies in order to receive either social benefits such as welfare, or in the case of the detainees here in Georgia, as a function of their incarceration, right? They were told it was a routine health procedure and they ended up without a uterus, right? That's not something ethics can address. Ethics is a code of professional conduct, right? Perhaps instead we should be talking about a moral code of harm reduction when deploying complex algorithmic solutions to social problems. Simultaneously, putting more brown bodies in positions of power will not make algorithmic culture more accountable, right? My students at Georgia Tech complain bitterly that corporations and higher education have completely eviscerated diversity of all meaning. One even pointed out that their board, that this is actually not that recent, right? But there was an Apple VP of Human Resources, a Black woman, right? Who was celebrating, who noted that Apple celebrated intellectual diversity when it was pointed out to her that their board of directors was all white men, right? So the word has been corrupted, mischaracterized, and misunderstood. Diversity only registers as a plastic representation of bodies. It never addresses the complex web of relations, standpoints, and intersection that color, pun intended, decision-making priority, who counts over a body count. Instead, I suggest that we could consider a praxis of harm reduction. And this is from the work of Roderick Crooks, Tanya Sutherland, and a few other people, right? That we should decenter putative social goods as a rationale for fixing algorithmic culture. So not how can it help people, but what if we started from how would this harm people, right? Harm is multivalent. It directs attention to collective injury and individual injury, and to responses to threat and wrongdoing, right? It can be the sacrifice of one human need to serve another, right? Equally vital one. A demand that we surrender autonomy or put on masks, right, in exchange for medicine and shelter. Powerful systems distribute harm differently. Powerful systems distribute harm to differently valued bodies according to known historical trajectories of violence, exploitation, and profit. We are always already enmeshed in non-innocent infrastructures. While humans make the strategic decisions to encode social media feeds, websites, and the like, it is the algorithm that helps to be responsible for the tactical placement of these posted advertisements, both to your relatives who you can't talk to at Thanksgiving, who are constantly inundated by news sources and agitators who tell them that the United States is going to the dogs because brown people are taking over, or to Black Facebook and internet users who are constantly inundated with images of Black death at the hands of the state. Should we absolve the machine of any responsibility in the distribution of this information? My argument is no. This is one approach, this qualitative theoretical approach, by arguing for understanding that these algorithms, these decision-making processes are always already anti-Black, and it offers one way to understand the computer's role in reifying anti-Blackness in information online. And that's enough talking. I'm going to stop there. If I can get my cursor to act right, come back. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Brock. And I want to let everyone know who's in attendance that, again, you can ask questions in the Q&A box below. So you'll see it at the bottom of your screen. If you're worried about privacy, we'll just read your first name, or if you can put in the note also if you don't want us to read any name at all. So we'll take turns reading those questions aloud. While we're waiting for audience questions, Steph, did you want to start us off with a question? Not to put you on the spot, but if not, I can also ask one or Ty. But.
Sure, it's hard to follow that, but I'll give it a try. André, as we were chatting before we got started, I was lucky enough to hear snippets of the book in development back in 2016. And even today, as I was rereading the introduction, I noticed towards the end of it, you talk about the evolution of your thinking as you picked up different theories and theorists along the way. And one of the things one of the key concepts that comes out in your book that I think was added after our conversations in 2016 was libidinal economy. And this is the one that I get the most questions from all my students about. So I'm going to ask you to just, if you can go over it just a little bit, but also I know you gave us an example, a couple of examples of libidinal economy, but if you could just maybe elaborate a bit more on that concept and why you felt it was integral to your thoughts, to your book, and give us another example that might help us wrap our heads around it.
Absolutely. I came to libidinal economy through the work of Frank Wilderson and Fred Moten and Jared Sexton, who talk about the philosophical construct of Afro-pessimism, right? And for them, Afro-pessimism trades upon this theory of anti-Blackness, that Black people are not legible to Western society in any way, form, or possibility, right? They're not even human. They can't be agents. And anything that they do will be taken from them. And so they use libidinal economy themselves to talk about an arrangement of desires, of hatreds, of passions, of lusts, of anxieties, so many different ways of talking about intense emotional responses to the way the world works. And they offer this avocation of libidinal economy as a way to understand why things don't necessarily operate rationally, right? And so I'm coming out of information science. And when I first started doing my doctoral work in information science, I was encountering digital divide research. Some of y'all may be familiar with it. And a lot of that operates on a deficit model, that Black folk don't use information technologies because they don't have the money, they don't have the technical capacity, they don't have the desire, they don't want to be educated, right? They just want to be dumb, right? And to me, those are not necessarily rational ways of understanding Black engagement with technology or lack of engagement, right? And so libidinal economy helps me to unpack a little bit of that, right? What are these beliefs that are powering the deployment of policies, the deployment of technologies to certain neighborhoods, right? Similarly, Western technoculture would have us believe, and this is the Protestant ethic, right, that work is good for us, right? If you work, you are a real person, right? And that the aim of the West and modernity should be productivity and efficiency, right? But W.E.B. Du Bois, in a libidinal economic moment, says that there's nothing more joyous than the laughter of a laborer on Saturday night, right? He's worked hard all week, but he has this moment of rest and relaxation where he can exist in the fullness of himself, using the money that he made during the week to enjoy himself. And for me, that also speaks to libidinal economy. So political economy cannot capture the forces that surround any particular rational decision or political decision, right? I mentioned during the talk when I was digressing that the ways that work has been argued for since the pandemic, where in the United States, actually the mayor of Chicago shut teachers out of their work altogether because the teachers like, we don't want to die. And the mayor was like, no, but you need to work. Somebody's got to watch my kids, right? And so that to me, that insistence that I have value, even though the system does not have value, see me as contributing any value beyond my capacity for labor, is again a libidinal economic moment, right? I get pushback on why I didn't go to Lacan and Deleuze and Guattari, and sorry, Steph, I don't understand the French. The French are hard for me. It was hard enough to get through Lyotard, right? But also I find that for me, Lyotard's insistence on an economy, on an exchange, was really valuable, right? Because one of my favorite examples that he uses is, how does one determine the exchange value of love, right? And that's really helpful when I start talking about what does it mean to be a friend on Facebook. Facebook says a friend is a person who you and that person agree have some sort of relationship to where you can exchange information. That is a political, economic, and informational definition of what a friend is. But Facebook has had to amend that 17 billion times over the last 15 years because we have different categories of friendship based on trust, based on intimacy, based on time, based on proximity, based on kinship patterns, right? And all of those things cannot be accounted for simply by a mechanical exchange of tokens where I say, I'm your friend, you're my friend, right? And so to me, that libidinal economy helps explain why we complicate. I think Facebook, the one thing I do give credit for Facebook is the phrase "is complicated," right? Because that describes so many things in this world. And so libidinal economy helps me. I said, I was being kind of glib when I said it helps me to operationalize it, right? And distributed Blackness, I talk about frames of practice, right? Because I find that libidinal economy gives me the space to say, what beliefs are animating the practices that people end up doing in this particular space, right? And that using libidinal economy allows me to talk about affect, allows me to talk about structures of feeling that the simple understanding of what an interface does, according to Fitts' law or according to responsive design will not tell me. So anti-blackness was how I got there. We can talk a little bit, if your audience is ready, on why I didn't stay with Afro-pessimism and I now have come out of the closet as an Afro-optimist, right? But that's a slightly different discussion.
Okay, that helps. That helps to knit some of these pieces together. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read a question from Sadie. So Sadie thanks you for both your book and talk and writes, I'm really interested in your formulation of distribution, and I'm wondering if you can talk about it a little more in relation to both spatiality and temporality. And thanks you.
So part of this is based on Christina Sharp in the Wake and other folk talking about the Middle East, the Mid-Atlantic Passage. I think I said it right. All right. Where bodies of Black folk were forcibly transported across the ocean to the United States, to South America and to Canada, right? And so in one way, I talk about the distribution of Blackness in that way. From an Afro-optimistic perspective, Blackness pre-exists the Middle Atlantic Passage, right? We were Black before that, but there's something about putting it in the context of Western modernity that helps to concretize in ways that are not usually good, but seem to, work out in some other ways, right? What Blackness is for this particular social, political, historical, cultural moment, right? And we're distributed, right? So my Caribbean folk understand that better than Americans do. My Brits and Europeans understand that better than Americans do as well, because I often point out that there are more Trinidadians living in Toronto than on the island of Trinidad, right? There are more Puerto Ricans living in New York than are on the island of Puerto Rico, right? They still consider themselves Puerto Ricans, Afro-diasporic, Latinidad diasporic, right? But they have a collective understanding, and this is why it's distributed, right? Collective understanding distributed across all those bodies that are united by a shared understanding of culture and intentionality, right? And so the network is really important to me, right? Because I try not to focus on individual instances, because we can always find an Oprah, a Shaquille O'Neal, a LeBron James, I don't know, a Paul Gilroy or Stuart Hall, who is an example of Black exceptionalism or deviance, right? We could talk about Flavor Flav, right? But in the aggregate, I'm much more interested in talking about the possibilities of Black culture that happen because we are distributed, right? And that formulation even applies if you look back at the continent, right, of Africa, where many of those formerly kinship group, formerly tribal groups have been aggregated into nation states, distributed across a political reimagining of what their territory is that doesn't necessarily conform to their historical patterns, right? So if you think about Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, that part still stays salient to me as well. There's much that modernity has done in its counting, distribution, and taxation of bodies to construct a distributed identity across a geographic space or across an informational space.
Thank you so much. I'm actually going to ask a question. So I noticed that there are Black people in the future. Alicia B. Wormsley's line is in your background. And when I saw it as your Zoom background, I was thinking about the section at the end of the book where you kind of talk about Afrofuturism and Afro-pessimism and Afro-optimism. So you just hinted at this a little bit, but can you explain or speak more to kind of your turn towards optimism as you just kind of hinted at, or?
So Afro-pessimism, in addition to anti-blackness, operates from this principle that Orlando Patterson talked about in the late 1900s. I love that phrase, right? Where blackness is social death, right? Black folk have no access to the franchise, meaning being able to vote, or to cultural production, right? So social death. And Fred Moten, when he talks about Afro-optimism, says instead, blackness is sociality. It is living life in the graveyard of political death, right? I argue for it as the second line. For those of you who are familiar with New Orleans culture, where a group of people will march down the street playing joyous jazz music and the like, and dancing to commemorate the passing of someone they cared about, or the Ghanaian funeral dancers. But also, it's not just limited to Black folk. Like, we could talk about the Irish Wake, right? Where people get extremely massively drunk to commemorate the passing of someone they cared about. So in death, we come together, right, to commemorate the passing of someone we cared about or someone we hated. You know, those are sometimes the best funerals, right? And so that funereal moment, Funereal, is at once an understanding that life has an ending, but that we continue life past that moment in our memory of those who have gone before and how we will continue living our lives afterward, right? To me, that had a special kind of resonance in this pandemic moment where I've lost my brother and my mom. I've lost extended family members as well. And I feel like they're here with me. They want me to continue to excel as I do so. And in thinking of that, that means that it's not an Afro-pessimistic moment where nothing I do counts because whiteness is bound to hold me down. Instead, it's an optimistic moment where I continue living in their memory, in their spirit, in the person that they wanted me to be. And so to me, Afro-optimism is that moment, that mutual networks of care and self-repair, a spiritual understanding that you can make $1 out of 15 cents, right? Black girl magic is one of those. And, you know, it's just being willing to live past survival, right? Past racism and discrimination in ways that vivify you and allow you to continue. So usually I mention Michael Williams, who's a comedian. Most people know him as Cat Williams. And he says, you know, you can't be angry at everything all day. Black life is not just about resistance. Even protesters eat bacon. Are you angry at bacon? Right? bacon is delicious. How are you gonna be angry at bacon, right? So that capacity of food to bring us life and energy is part of the Afro-optimistic thing where you can enjoy breakfast and then go out and say ACAB, right? Or whatever your preferred term is, right? Because you have to sustain yourself and your family in order to make it through to the next day.
Thank you. And I'm also so sorry for your loss. But thank you so much for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Ty, would you like to read the next question, or if you have one of your own as well?
Yeah, the next question comes from Kaylin. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Do you think that TikTok has some of the makings like Black Twitter? I noticed that many of the Black creators stitch duet some of the same topics like we chat about on Twitter as Black folks.
I'm not sure what the question is. What's the question?
I think they're asking kind of what are the kind of differences and similarities that you see between kind of TikTok and Twitter as these platforms?
TikTok, Instagram, Snap, Vine and Periscope before them, Instagram Live, Facebook Live Stories are all televisual forms, which means that a lot of the interpretations we do of the contents that's posted are from a cultural matrix as opposed to the written word. Right? So I love Twitter because I've been reading all my life, and most of Twitter is text. Right? They do have images, they do have GIFs. We can repost content from other networks, but the majority of Twitter is text. And I am trained as a person who loves to read and as a literary scholar to extract meaning from text. But a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And the short form of all of those video social networking services encourages the transmission of strong emotion in that brief moment, right? Think about Vine. Vine was 6 seconds, right? Live, both Facebook and Instagram, I think were originally like 2 or 3 minutes. They then got expanded to 10. And in certain circumstances, you can run them for hours if you wish, right? But that brevity, that short form encourages you to transmit a message that will affect your receiver as strongly as possible, as quickly as possible, right? And so in doing so, they have a slightly different affect than Twitter does, even though Twitter is also a slightly short form, but it's also framed by the intimacy of the framing of the device, right? So it's notable that TikTok and Twitter don't have great, TikTok and Instagram don't have great PC interfaces. Your web browser on your desktop is not the ideal place to view Instagram or TikTok or other spaces. It's your phone, right? And your phone has a very interesting relationship in terms of your embodied cognition. It is a screen. At this point in time, they're about 6 inches. They're high definition, really rich colors, right? Held in your hand that only allow you to focus on one thing at a time. If you see someone's face in that screen, that camera is zoomed in on their face, right? Or their body. There's a reason why TikTok dances are now claimed to only be from the waist up, because that's how far down the camera goes, right? It focuses on the parts of the body that we're most used to interpreting. Think of the difference between a TikTok video and movies that you see in the cinema, right? The cinema allows for the expanse of landscapes and settings. TikTok really has this intimate gaze onto the face of a person. And that intimacy is part and parcel of what these platforms do in order to entice engagement, right? But also to get you to continually return to them as a way to understand yourself and the people you're like, right? It also kind of shortcuts things, right? And by shortcut, I mean, it takes life out of the context of history. So I've been looking at TikToks where young Gen Z folk are saying the slang that they use is just internet slang. It has nothing to do with African-American vernacular English, right? And I'm like, that is ahistorical AF, right? Because there were Black people on TikTok saying these things. And in many cases, we can tell somebody who had a really good video that a lot of white folk who use Black slang on TikTok sound like one person, right? They don't sound like the multiple regional variations that I can hear from an Atlanta person, from a Houston person, from a New York person, from a California person. They all sound like, what's his name from Malibu's Most Wanted? Yo, cuz we gonna do X, Y, and Z. Sorry, that's really dismissive, my bad, right? But because they're flattened into that one representation of Blackness, for some reason they have associated with the property of themselves. And TikTok really affords that because it says these videos that we're gonna serve you endlessly, that all you have to do is swipe to change, but we'll still send you the same thing over and over again. That is the world that you inhabit at this point. Right. And so there are interface considerations, there are material considerations, the size of the phone that you have. Can you imagine trying to do TikTok on a flip phone? It just wouldn't work, right? Same reason why doing TikTok on your browser is not as intimate. I'm sorry, on your browser, on your laptop or your desktop is not as intimate as looking at it in your hand. Same thing with Snapchat, right? The intimacy of your mind-body connection between your hand, your phone, your eyeballs, and the screen, right, does a lot of work in creating a shared community, a shared identity between yourself and the people who use the service. That was a whole class in like 2 minutes. Yeah. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thanks. Steph, would you like to read the next one from Mark?
Sure. I think this ties into a bit of what I was asking about before. My colleague at Concordia, actually, Mark Steinberg, asks, well, he says, thank you for this amazing talk. I really appreciate the libidinal economy framework. Can you explain how libidinal economy relates to artifact, practice, belief framework? Is it part of the belief or cultural? Is it part of the belief or something in each of the terms? And I just kind of building on what you were just saying about TikTok and also these elements of artifact, practice, belief, I wonder if you might also tie this into your methodology, critical technocultural discourse analysis.
Alicia. Okay, so libidinal economy is explicitly meant to try to formalize what I wanted to talk about with belief, right? Because belief is super abstract, right? And Steph and I, and probably you, Dr. Steinberg, have lived through an era where all of internet studies was talking about affect for about 5 minutes, and it was some of the sloppiest scholarship. It wasn't great, right? Because there was no real way to try to assess what affect meant from paper to paper, from discipline to discipline. It was this wide thing where anybody could have affect. For me, libidinal economy works because of the economic aspect to it, right? You're arguing that there's something that powers the exchange between belief and practice, between belief and artifact, right? But you're also acknowledging that that exchange is not wholly rational. That exchange is not wholly technical, right? So both Steph and her crew and CTDA, both of our methods look at interfaces, right? And we both argue for interfaces as meaning-making constructs, right? If you are an HCI researcher, you don't really care as much about meaning as we think you should, right? You're much more concerned with responsiveness or time to reaction or whether or not this element fits within the screen properly, right? And you'll create these things which are technically sophisticated and then not understand why users don't necessarily take up that particular form, right? Nobody understood why the telephone would become a device for sociality. They thought the telephone, when it was designed, would strictly be something for people to communicate business orders between businesses. They had no idea that housewives in remote areas or suddenly remote areas, bedroom suburbs, would use the telephone to connect with each other, right, during the day when they were trapped in the house with kids and laundry and domestic servants and lots of tasks, right? That affordance, right, I think can be captured by using libidinal economy in a way that is interesting, right? In a way, I'm not going to say innovative, but interesting, right? And it's a little fancier than trying to look at historical patterns, but it also worked for me because I was able to understand the beliefs expressed by users of technology and the beliefs expressed by the interfaces at the same time. Does that make sense? So one of the arguments for CTDA is that users are always already understanding themselves through whatever medium they express themselves, right? In other words, and the term user itself is a problematic construct, right? Because is the way in which I utilize a technical artifact only to be understood in how well I use it, right? Is a dunk in the NBA? Do different dunkers dunk differently, right? Does each dunker not during the dunk contest during the NBA All-Star game demonstrate their capacity, their invention, their height, their ability to jump up, the different ways they can make the dunk look there? All of these things, these expressive qualities are what they bring to the practice through their individual and cultural understanding, right? And I feel like libidinal economy helped me to capture that in a way that wasn't necessarily acceptable by saying, well, Black people believe this. Because I can tell you, when I first started doing this research and I said, well, Black people think this, people are like, well, you need to cite that. There wasn't enough stuff out there to cite, right? I would argue similarly for exercise research on queer folk or exercises on women. Like, we had to build the literature step by step to say these are the beliefs that animate feminists or people who are interested in being agentive because they're trans. We had to do the work to explicate why they believe that they were entitled to have certain practices and beliefs. Libidinal economy, to a certain extent, helps me to work around that. Around is not the right word, right? So there are libidinal economies present in all three aspects of Casey's construct: in the artifact, the code, the hardware, the practices. So what does Facebook believe when it tells you that they're trying to build a community, right? But then the users, right? When's the last time Mark posted to Facebook? Does Mark even post to Facebook, right? He might not, but there are millions of my relatives across the world who bring themselves and particular ways of understanding themselves in Facebook, which is different from how they understand themselves in Instagram and LinkedIn and Twitter. And all of those things tend to revolve around what they believe about themselves when they're using the artifact. And libidinal economy has been really helpful for me to argue that.
Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing. I want to be mindful of your time. We also lose our captioner in 5 minutes. We've asked all the audience questions. I just want to note that Virgin also thanks you for your amazing presentation, and I'd like to join with that. Thank you so much for being here and for answering all of our questions. Thank you, Steph, for co-hosting. Thank you, Ty, for all of your work on the tech side. And thank you, Sarah, for doing the captioning. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. We really appreciate it. If you want to come back to the recording, or you have any friends or family or colleagues who have missed it, please direct them to our website. We usually take about a week to get it up because we want to make sure that our human done captions are all matched up. So we hope we see you next week. We're going to be on the next 3 events are on Thursdays for the semester. So thank you all so much for your time and support. Thank you.